Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name's Frederick Wheeler. Today I have been asked to explain how to determine the difficulty class for a perception check. So that is the topic of this video. If you have not watched my video on making a perception check, please do so first. That will make this a lot easier. The difficulty class for a perception check is usually determined by the adventure book you are actually running, or by the Dungeon Master. So what is a difficulty class? Well, it is the target number required to equal or exceed to be successful. And you make them when you're making an ability check, a saving throw, or a skill check. In this case, we're going to talk about the perception check. Here is a guide I use for figuring out the value for a perception check to be successful. There are two types of difficulty class. One, there is the static, and two, there is the dynamic. Now the static DC or difficulty class is something that the Dungeon Master determines by deciding what the difficulty of the actual action is. You can figure this out by looking at your player's handbook on page 174. It actually has a chart or table showing you what is very easy, medium or moderate, hard, very hard, and nearly impossible. Here are some examples of static perception checks, or DCs or difficulty classes that you might come across. So very easy is a DC of 5. So that would be something like hearing a conversation at another table, or hearing a battle through a door, or smelling smoke. Something that is easy would be a DC 10 or difficulty class 10. And that would be something like hearing a far off storm, a thunderstorm of some kind. Maybe spotting a landmark in the far distance, way ahead. Hearing a conversation through a door, if you put your ear up to the door. Hearing a battle through a wall. A battle makes a lot of noise, so you'll probably be able to hear it through a wall with a DC 10 check. Now, if we're dealing with the medium or moderate checks, that is a DC 15. Tracking footprints over soft ground would be a DC 15 perception check. Or seeing spots of blood, small spots of blood on the ground. Or hearing a conversation through a wall. Noticing a camouflaged pit trap. All sort of DC 15 sort of checks. Now for the hard checks, a hard check is a DC 20, and that would be something like noticing a secret door. I would say secret doors, detecting them would be a DC 20 plus. Something like seeing a trap trigger line, that little line that you see that you can trip over. Or hearing a whisper or a whispered conversation through a door would be a 20 for your perception check. Now something that's very hard, that is a DC 25, that would be like tracking footprints over hard ground like rock or wood. Tracking somebody over soft ground after it has rained. Noticing a trap pressure plate on the ground would be very hard to spot. So a DC 25. Near impossible is the 30. So that's something like noticing a magical trap, even if that's even possible. It might require, you have to detect magic to find a trap. But if you're going to allow a perception check for detecting magical traps, to actually spot that tiny magical rune, you might actually require a DC 30 for your perception check. Hearing a whisper through a whispered conversation through a wall is very hard to do. Near impossible. Tracking over hard ground like rock and stone after it has poured with rain or there has been snow. So those are all static checks. Now you don't have to use these values in these examples. Really it's up to you as the Dungeon Master to figure this out. Often this is explained in the adventure books. Dynamic difficulty classes or DCs change, and this is because they are usually determined by a contest between 2 or 3 different skills or ability checks. They can also be affected by environmental factors. The most common dynamic perception check is usually when a monster is trying to stealth, hide or ambush the player's character, or vice versa. If monsters are waiting to ambush the player's characters, there's three different methods you can use, for determining what the perception check should be. Okay, let's talk about the three different types of dynamic perception checks. The first dynamic perception check is the automatic failure. This is when your character or a monster is distracted or doing something else, which means they can't be aware of their surroundings fully. They are doing something else, they're not aware of their surroundings completely, therefore there is no active perception check and you do not use a passive perception check either. Automatic failure. Number two is the passive perception. Now passive perception is when you use it for being generally aware of your surroundings. So you are keeping watch, looking out for danger as you travel. Maybe you're taking the night watch and you're just making sure during your watch that everything is safe. You would use a passive check. Next is the active perception check. Now an active perception check is used primarily when either your monster is specifically searching for something. They've noticed something, or your players say, I want to search that group of trees. I think there's something up there. Then you would ask them to make an active perception check. And you only really use an active perception check when the players actually state that. When there isn't a chance to roll the dice again. If they're constantly rolling a 20-sided dice, you're better off using a passive perception check. So if you haven't seen my video on passive checks, then I suggest you have a quick look at it. But that's how it generally works for a dynamic perception check. Okay, that's everything. If you found this video helpful or informative, please share, like and subscribe. Make a comment below if you have any questions about how to determine the difficulty class for a perception check. It's a very personal thing and I have only really given you a guide. Until next time, keep rolling those 20s.